This is a segment on the show that we like to call Dr. J Answers. Really, it's a new format to Veracity Hill. You know, we've been going for 7 or 8 episodes now. I've already lost track, which is good news. I wanted to jump into the controversy surrounding Mike Licona and Lydia McGrew. I want to first describe what the contention is between them. Mike published that book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, in 2017. Here it is right here. And this spurred on a critique by Lydia McGrew, the wife of Christian apologist and philosopher Tim McGrew. Lydia is a philosopher in her own right, multiple published works in epistemology. She's jumped her hand into New Testament scholarship here and has presented some analytical critiques to Mike's proposal. And this has caused great controversy, and I want to get to what is the core disagreement. So Lydia's position is explicitly at odds with what she calls, with Mike's proposal, or some of the compositional devices. She tends to call them literary devices. What they do, she alleges, is they change the facts. She first called this fictionalizing in her book, The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. So I want to first review with you, the reader, especially if you've read this book by Lydia. I want to first review what her criteria is for fictionalizing. This is important because this is the issue of the divide between those who follow McGrew and those who follow Licona. Now, Licona and others, myself, object to the term fictionalizing, and we would even object to the idea of fact-changing. And I'll get into that more. But there's this connotation, especially with fictionalizing. The connotation is that the evangelists intentionally would mislead people. Now, if you've read Mike's book, he says at the outset that what Plutarch did when he made edits to stories, he was intending not to mislead people, but rather to convey a deeper truth about some aspect of an event. Now, with the Gospels, we have more theology than Plutarch's lives. With the Gospels, we have theological truths that the evangelists, in some cases, wanted to draw out. There are theological themes, for example, in the book of Matthew, in Mark. All the 4 Gospels have themes that the evangelists wanted to play up. So they made certain changes to the stories to convey those truths. They sought to be faithful in how they communicated what had happened, for the benefit of their reader. Now, Lydia has objected to this, and she's provided a criteria for what would qualify as fictionalizing, and later what she calls fact-changing, because there were a lot of people that came out and said, hey, that's the negative connotation. So she changed the term. But let's look at the 3 criteria there, and you can see some of my notes. I'm going to go through 4 different sections of her book here as we look at fictionalizing and her view of paraphrase. Let's read the paragraph beforehand. To avoid any misunderstanding, the following 3 criteria show what I mean by saying that an alteration of fact is fictionalization. The term is used throughout this book as a technical term, explicitly defined. This is a technical term. I take her at her word there. Let's think about the technicalities. 1. What is presented in a seemingly realistic fashion in the work is actually contrary to fact. The real facts have been altered. For example, an event presented as occurring in a certain year actually occurred in a different year. A discussion presented in the work did not recognizably occur in the historical context in which it is presented. An event presented realistically in the work was invented, and so forth. Let me make a comment here. So, number 1, the real facts have been altered. I'm already noticing 2 concerns with this first step. 1, what does it mean when she writes the real facts? How rigid of a historical account are we expecting? Now, she calls her view the historical reportage, but what does it mean when the real facts have been altered? What constitutes as a real fact, and how rigid do we need that fact to be? We'll get into that as we talk about paraphrase. Number 2, she writes, a discussion presented in the work did not recognizably occur. That's the second concern. What does that mean? That it was recognizable. We will get into that again. Let's go on to number 2. The alteration of fact was made by the author deliberately. The author did not, if the act is a fictionalization, make a mere mistake while trying to tell the truth. He did not misremember. He did not make a reasonable, good paraphrase of a person's speech based upon memory or sources he had reason to believe are accurate, a point I shall return to later. He did not merely write quickly or carelessly in a way that accident gave a misimpression. He knew that to think that it did happen, yet he wrote as he did with the deliberate intention of presenting the event as if it happened that way in the narrative. That's number 2. There's another red flag here. It's one that's not so apparent. The red flag that I see is when someone is begging the question. Begging the question is not, it leads to this question to be asked. Begging the question is when you assume the conclusion. We're already seeing here certain exceptions. So she's importing her own view into this set of criteria. And she's giving exceptions and making exceptions without adequate justification. That's special pleading. That's saying, hey, don't pay attention to the maybe not so good reasons I have for excluding this here from the definition, because we're going to get into that with paraphrase. The point here is, number 2, the alteration of fact was made by the author deliberately. She's going to come back to that word, deliberate, when she talks about paraphrasing. Number 3, the alteration of fact is invisible to the audience within that work itself. There is no tag in the text, no wink within the movie to show that this is not true. There is no equivalent of once upon a time or there once was a man within the artistic work that signals what follows did not really happen. Now, you can see my little note there that chapter 1, verse 1 seems like it very well could be a tag for the whole work. That's number 3. The alteration is invisible. Really, we're going to be sticking with 1 and 2. Those are her 3 steps, her 3 criteria for what qualify as fictionalizing or fact-changing. Again, what is presented in a seemingly realistic fashion in the work is actually contrary to fact. The real facts have been altered. And number 2, the alteration of fact was made by the author deliberately. I want to steel man, which is to say, give the best view here. I want to steel man this criteria, and let's steel man the historical reportage model. We want to avoid any fact changing because that would be misleading. It would mean that it's historically unrecognizable and historically unreliable. The Gospels would be unreliable, says Lydia, if they did this sort of thing. That's fictionalizing. That's the review. That's the concern against Lycona's model, and she's got this big book based upon her blog series. This is essentially what it is. And I've been intimately familiar with this debate for years. I saw this from the very first moments it was occurring and transpiring. I'm intimately familiar. I've been keeping track of the blog posts that Lydia wrote, and I know you can go to her blog site. It's now archived. She's copied the old posts over to her new or her older blog spot. It's now where everything lives. Let's get into her view of paraphrase, okay? So we've gone over what fictionalizing or fact-changing is and the criteria for it. Now let's get into paraphrase. So this is from her blog Extra Thoughts. This post was published in 2020, where she continues on her critique, okay, which she started back in 2017, 2018. Let me read from this blog post here. But something that deserves to be called paraphrase of what someone else historically said will always be recognizable, and especially if it's said in a particular time and place. If you tell people that this is what this person said on this occasion in answer to this question and so forth, it should be recognizable as what he said at that time and place. With a true paraphrase of the spoken word said at a particular time, the idea is that if you were there and knew the relevant languages, you could have recognized what was said from the paraphrase. Notice the contrast here to what Evans says things about the sayings like I am the light of the world and other sayings in the Gospel of John. She's comparing it to Evans and what she calls a loose paraphrase. That's a term that other New Testament scholars accept. Lydia accommodates for narrow paraphrase. Let me also pull from her book here. She says one sentence that is particularly close to what Mike Licona says. In her book, she gives an example of a guy named Bill, who tells basically his critique of Department of Transportation. That's my own elaboration of this, if you will. What the city is doing regarding a street. And Bill is concerned. What about paraphrase? Here I want to emphasize that the special use of this term is not like any ordinary use of the word at all and is bound to confuse. And she gives an example of how she paraphrases. But then, when she gives that shortened example, she says, this is what would legitimately be called giving the gist of what Bill said. giving the gist. If you followed Mike's work, that is a word that he uses to describe not only paraphrase, but other literary devices that the gospel authors were giving the gist. It's a faithful, reliable communication of what transpired. We get the gist. She continues, the content and even some wording are quite close, well within the normal expected range. What does that mean? What is the normal expected range? She is importing her own assumption on what is normal and what is expected. She doesn't go through explaining what she means by that. Now, she might give examples here or there, but what justifies her narrow scope of what is normal and expected? That you don't receive in this book. Then she goes on to give this other example where she draws in another conversation, hypothetical conversation with hypothetical Bill. And she creates this composite story. And she has Bill say things that Bill didn't really say. He didn't say this at all. And in fact, you can see how in Lydia's hypothetical, she is conveying something that even goes beyond what Bill would have said. And in this regard, this example is a weak example. She's trying to disprove this loose paraphrase camp. But this is a bad example because she's intentionally trying to give a bad example. She's not trying to give a faithful example, an example that would be faithful to what Bill had said. It's an unfaithful paraphrase of Bill's position because she's taking two different meanings in two different conversations and implying the one and the other. The second conversation is where Bill says he distrusts the city. So Lydia applies that into a different context. So it's not an intent to faithfully, reliably convey what Bill said. So it's a bad loose paraphrase. Now, here's where we're going to get some trickiness. We have here now, page 24, The Mirror or the Mask. Lydia McGrew's view of paraphrase collapses into fictionalizing and fact-changing. She argues, moreover, there is an important distinction between deliberately changing what someone said, remember that's fictionalizing, while presenting it as his words, because you think that you can say it better, and paraphrasing because you have no choice given a gap of time or space. A gap of time or space you might just cut down for brevity. And it's a reliable, faithful, very limited change. Now, paraphrase is using different words to convey the same meaning. But you're using different words. You're changing what was said when you paraphrase. Now, people are going to object and say, no. Well, you're being faithful to the concept. Sorry. Read the criteria for fictionalizing. The real facts have been altered. The real facts of what have been said are altered. Paraphrasing, using this criteria that she has created, just because she creates the rules of the game, doesn't mean we can't question the rules of the game. We don't have to consent to the game she's playing. So I am objecting to the criteria, but what I'm doing right now is presenting an internal critique. What I'm really suggesting here is that this criteria needs revision. So she says, consciously upgrading Jesus's words or someone else's words for theological or literary reasons is a different sort of activity from moderate paraphrase undertaken because exact replication is not possible. So you can see here that she's concerned over deliberate changes being made. Right there. There it is in the text. You can see it. She's got that concern. It's no secret. Now let's play a clip from her reply video series that she did in response to Mike Licona. She gives 3 reasons why someone might paraphrase.
For paraphrase might be idiom or a way that the person speaks that's just not going to be understood. So if I'm reporting that someone said, that's for the birds, I'm not going to do that. And my audience is Australian, they're not going to know that. Figure of speech, that's for the birds. So when reporting what he said to them, I might say, and he said, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. So that kind of paraphrase, which retains the meaning, is a faithful paraphrase that could even be done deliberately, but for purposes of better understanding.
Oh, what? Let's replay this. I'm going to describe it for you. This is what I would call an adaptation. When you take an idiom in one culture and you adapt it to the culture of the new audience, she allows for this adaptation, what she calls paraphrase. This is one of the 3 types of paraphrasing, and she's got no problem with it because it remains true to the concept. Now, don't hear me wrong here. I agree that that's acceptable. I disagree that she thinks her criteria for fictionalizing doesn't apply here. Remember, we're trying to apply this criteria to her model, the historical reportage model. She's now made an exception. And I say, wait a second, no, that doesn't follow the rules that you've created. Let's listen to this again. And notice she uses that term deliberately. And I think she even says improves upon, which she, as I just read from the Mirror of the Mask here, she objects to. I'll read it again, then we'll listen again. Moreover, there's an important distinction between deliberately changing what someone said while presenting it as his words, because you think that you can say it better, and paraphrasing because you have no choice given a gap of time or space. Consciously upgrading Jesus's words or someone else's words for theological or literary reasons is a different sort of activity. All right, here we go. Let's play this again.
Someone said, that's for the birds. I'm not going to do that. And my audience is Australian. They're not going to know that. Figure of speech, that's for the birds.
Okay, so she admits that the original audience isn't going to understand what was actually said. And so what's going to happen is that the facts of what was said are going to be altered. The real facts have been altered. It's literally her criteria and concern of fictionalizing.
So when reporting what he said to them, I might say, and he said, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. So that kind of paraphrase.
Notice the adaptation, as I would call it, is that's ridiculous. So she's now saying someone said that's ridiculous because it conveys the same meaning. But that's ridiculous is historically unrecognizable from what was actually said. Welcome to Lycona and Keener and Evans and Wallace's camp, because this is what they believe about the various other compositional devices. Welcome to the camp, folks. You've made it. Now, if you want to continue thinking that there's fictionalizing and fact-changing using this set of criteria, well, then you cannot allow for what I call adaptation, which fits here under paraphrasing. You can't allow for it because it changes the facts, and it was deliberately so. Here she says it.
Which retains the meaning is a faithful paraphrase that could even be done deliberately, but for purposes of better understanding.
For purposes of better understanding, we can't allow the authors to make the changes for better understanding. This is wholly inconsistent with fictionalizing according to the historical reportage model. You can see here that what she believes constitutes as paraphrasing, what she describes as an example of paraphrasing, goes against the criteria of fictionalizing. So in this regard, if Lydia McGrew believes that paraphrasing was an acceptable form of composition, then Lydia McGrew believes in fictionalizing or fact-changing compositional devices in the Gospels. That's my contention. I know some of you might vehemently disagree. You think I'm being uncharitable here. I'm simply asking you to look at the criteria. Don't allow the special pleading to occur. Consider whether there's adequate justification. Compare the criteria. Compare what paraphrasing is. Paraphrasing, by definition, is changing the words. And this goes against the criteria of fictionalizing. The criteria needs revision work because it doesn't allow for paraphrase. It doesn't allow for speeches. Oh, but Lydia does allow for these things. Yes, that's what she claims, but it's inconsistent when she does this. There's no adequate justification given the criteria of fictionalizing. I know I'm repeating myself because I don't think some of you are going to understand or get it right away. You need to look at the criteria and see what meets those qualifications. Adapting an idiom to a different culture makes it historically unrecognizable. It's changing the facts. The book Mirror of the Mask is riddled with McGrew's presumptuous assumptions, with an inaccurate cherry-picking data selection from ancient sources, full of straw men. It's almost like I really don't know where to start with this book. And I know I've written a little bit on her blog posts several years ago. I haven't really come out writing about her book yet, but in some ways I feel a small obligation to do so because many of you have read Mike's book, the first one, and you've read this, and I'm not persuaded that we're doing a good enough job analyzing the arguments she puts forth. We can't just assume the things she says are true. One quick example I'll give that I was looking at this morning in what she conveys about Theon and what Theon said. This is in her chapter called Going Crazy. This is regarding Kreia elaboration. With Kreia, you have these sayings. basically. And so you might have John's gospel, for example, having various chrea. She's talking about Theon, this ancient rhetorician, and the textbook that he wrote. She says, I quote the entire section to make it obvious that Theon is not talking about changing history at all, nor is he talking about putting words in anyone's mouth. He is talking about writing something like a speech, or what we might call an editorial, and improving upon a different author's way of making the same point. Now, a couple things here. First, I do want to say she doesn't even provide everything Theon provides. When she describes on the previous page the different examples of Theon, it's an incomplete data set. But this quote in particular, she doesn't provide the whole. And it's almost like she trusts you not to go investigate yourself. But if you want to investigate Theon, here's a translation by Kennedy. I recommend it. Check it out so you can read Theon yourself and not just take McGrew's take on Theon. She says again, I quote the entire section to make it obvious that Theon is not talking about changing history at all, nor is he talking about putting words in anyone's mouth. He's talking about writing something like a speech, or what we might call an editorial, and improving upon a different author's way of making the same point. Let's go back to Paraphrase, because she just said that what you can't do is you can't try to improve because you think that you can say it better. She's admitting Theon says authors can do that, improve upon a different author's way of making the same point. We can improve. This is inconsistent. I think her work needs to go back to the drawing board. It needs revision. I welcome scholars to revise their works. It's okay when people say they're wrong, but it's been particularly, and this is no secret to those who have followed the drama, it's been particularly annoying the way that this controversy has been conducted. Let's keep it on the level of ideas, the realm of scholarly discussion, civil discourse, but it hasn't been, unfortunately. What I've done here in Dr. J Answers, we're calling this McGrew's Mishaps. We very well might make more videos like this where we go over these mishaps, including the inconsistencies, cherry-picking data, non sequiturs, straw men. One thing that really sticks out to me years ago when I was reading this the first time was what she calls the historical nuggets approach to the Gospels and the New Testament. And she attributes that model to New Testament scholars, which is completely bogus, by the way. All the people she critiques would never and do not affirm that, and I've done the research in some of my notes about why they would reject that. At any rate, so there's a lot of material. There's almost so much that you don't know where to start, and it takes a lot of time to do this sort of thing. All right, I've said enough. I await people's responses. I welcome comments. I also welcome you to subscribe to my channel. I'm sure I'll do some more videos on this in the future. It's not on my immediate radar, but I felt compelled to talk about it. Feel free to write back to me. You can go to veracityhill.com. You can find a lot of resources there, or old episodes and other blog posts, writings of mine. And if you like some of this content, I would love to have your monthly support for this ministry work, this educational ministry. Many of you who are my YouTube followers, you're non-believers, and so you might find yourself jumping into this New Testament scholarly debate that I have passion about, but nevertheless you might find that this is a valuable resource to Christians to think deeply about the Gospels in this particular case, for Christians to think deeply about their faith. These are complex issues that need clarifying. I hope that this ministry does do that as we seek to clarify those complex issues.